Smoke drifted above the ruins of Tokyo, rising from what had once been a city of 13 million souls. Streets lay silent beneath a haze of ash and dust. The air carried the faint scent of burned wood and steel, the remnants of a war that had finally ended. Beneath a collapsed roof, a young Japanese woman knelt among the rubble, clutching a tattered piece of cloth that had once been a family photo. From the distance, boots crunched over broken glass. A lone U.S. Marine, helmet tilted low, moved cautiously through the devastation. His uniform was stained with the grime of long campaigns across the Pacific. He stopped when he saw her. Fragile, trembling, starving. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the Marine extended his hand toward her. His voice was quiet, steady. "Come with me." And in that instant, the occupation began with an act of humanity. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer a nation at war. It was a nation in ruins. Entire cities had been erased from the map, their names turned into statistics of loss. Tokyo, once the beating heart of the empire, had been reduced to blackened ash. On the night of March 9, 1945, hundreds of American B-29 bombers swept across the city under the codename Operation Meeting House. In just a few hours, more than 100,000 civilians were killed. Wooden homes ignited like dry paper. The heat was so intense that canals boiled, and the air itself seemed to burn. Across Japan, destruction became the language of the sky. Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama all suffered the same fate. Yet even after months of relentless bombing, Tokyo still stood as a symbol of defiance, its people enduring hunger and grief with silent resolve. Factories continued to operate in fragments. Soldiers prepared for an invasion they knew might never come, and propaganda promised an impossible victory. Then came August. On the 6th, the city of Hiroshima vanished in a blinding flash. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Entire families were vaporized in seconds, their shadows burned into walls. The power of these new weapons was beyond comprehension. In imperial broadcasts, silence hung heavier than words. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito faced the unimaginable. His voice, never before heard by the public, trembled through the radio on August 15, 1945. The message was formal, distant, yet world-changing. Japan would endure the unendurable and accept surrender. For millions of Japanese citizens, it was the first time they heard their emperor not as a god, but as a man, defeated, sorrowful, and human. In the days that followed, Allied ships appeared along the coasts. From the decks came soldiers not as conquerors, but as cautious observers stepping into an unknown land. The United States prepared to occupy a nation it had fought for nearly 4 years, a land both shattered and sacred, where the line between victor and victim had blurred. The war was over, but the world that emerged from its ashes was unrecognizable, and within that desolation, the first boots of the U.S. Marines touched Japanese soil. When the first contingents of U.S. Marines and Army personnel landed in Japan in late August 1945, they entered a world that barely resembled a functioning nation. What awaited them was not resistance, but silence. The Japanese population, weary, starving, and stripped of certainty, watched their former enemies march through the remnants of cities that had once defined their pride. Tokyo, the heart of the empire, was a wasteland. From the Imperial Palace to the Sumida River, entire districts had vanished beneath layers of ash and twisted iron. Children scavenged among ruins for anything that could burn, while women carried buckets of water through the skeletal remains of their homes. Food was scarce. Rice rations had fallen to barely enough for survival. Many lived on grass, roots, or whatever they could trade on the black market that emerged beneath the occupying soldiers' gaze. For the Marines, the devastation was almost beyond comprehension. They had fought across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. enduring some of the bloodiest combat in history. They expected defiance, ambushes, perhaps even suicide attacks. Instead, they found bowed heads and cautious gestures of respect. Japanese soldiers stacked their rifles neatly before surrendering. Civilians averted their eyes, torn between shame and relief. The occupation of Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, was not only a military act, but a moral and political experiment. Never before had a defeated imperial power been so thoroughly reshaped by its conquerors. The task was monumental: to disarm a nation, feed its starving millions, and rebuild its institutions without crushing its spirit. MacArthur established his headquarters in Tokyo's Daiichi Building, overlooking the ruins of the Imperial Palace, a visual symbol of America's new authority over Japan's future. Marines and soldiers became both enforcers and caretakers. They guarded supply depots, distributed food, and maintained order amid chaos. Yet every interaction carried the weight of history, the tension of victory meeting defeat. Many Marines were young men barely out of their teens, sent from small American towns into a country they had once been told to hate. Now they stood face to face with the human cost of that hatred. Orphaned children, widows, burned faces, silent hunger, and somewhere in that broken landscape, amid shattered homes and smoldering memories, a single encounter would define this fragile transition. When one Marine paused before a starving woman in the ruins of Tokyo and chose compassion over conquest. That moment would echo far beyond the rubble. The human angle in the aftermath of surrender, survival became Japan's silent war. Cities lay hollowed, and millions of civilians wandered through them like shadows. Tokyo's people faced hunger on a scale unseen in modern history. The rice ration, the soul of every Japanese meal, had dwindled to a fraction of what the body required. Farmers in distant villages hoarded their harvests, fearing confiscation. In the capital, desperate mothers traded heirlooms for scraps of grain. Yet amid that misery, there remained an unspoken dignity. Few begged. Instead, the Japanese bowed, quietly, respectfully, even to the soldiers of the nation that had destroyed their homes. The stoicism confused many Americans. Marines who had witnessed fanatic resistance on Okinawa now saw those same people lower their heads, not from fear, but from exhaustion and pride. In the ruins of Tokyo, silence was not just grief, it was discipline. The soldiers' angle for the Marines who now patrolled Japan's burned-out streets, the war's end did not erase its memories. Many carried ghosts of their own. Friends lost in island jungles, names left behind on coral beaches. They had been trained to hate the enemy, to see the Japanese as faceless adversaries. But as they looked into the hollow eyes of children and the trembling hands of widows, that hatred began to falter. Letters from occupation troops spoke of a strange transformation. "We came ready to fight," one Marine wrote home, "but all we found were people too weak to stand." Acts of kindness, a shared ration, a blanket, a cigarette, became gestures of uneasy humanity. In those moments, the uniform no longer separated victor from vanquished. Both were simply human beings standing in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. The leadership angle at the top of this fragile new order stood General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers. His task was not vengeance, but renewal. MacArthur understood that Japan's destruction was total, but its spirit could still be guided, reshaped into something peaceful, democratic, and enduring. He forbade occupation troops from humiliating civilians and emphasized discipline and respect. His policy was simple yet revolutionary: to rebuild Japan not as a colony, but as a partner in peace. Under his command, relief efforts began. Food shipments arrived. Public order was restored. MacArthur's headquarters overlooked the Imperial Palace. a daily reminder that authority had shifted, but civilization must not collapse. He believed the real victory would not be measured in punishment, but in the rebirth of a nation once defined by war. And below his office windows, the first signs of that rebirth flickered in small acts of decency, like a Marine extending a hand to a woman in the rubble. The technological angle, the war in the Pacific, had been, above all, a contest of technology and endurance. By 1945, American industry had transformed warfare into an unstoppable machine. The B-29 Superfortress, the giant bomber that darkened Japan's skies, represented the pinnacle of that might. From the airfields of Tinian and Saipan, squadrons of these aircraft could reach Tokyo in hours, carrying incendiary bombs that turned entire neighborhoods into firestorms. The technology that had once symbolized progress became the instrument of annihilation. Japan's wooden cities, designed for tradition, became vulnerable targets in an industrial war. When the atomic bomb appeared, it was seen not as innovation, but as inevitability, the final expression of a science that no longer asked if it should, only if it could. By the time the U.S. occupation began, the technological dominance had become a burden as well as a triumph. The same engineers who had built destruction were now needed to rebuild. The machines that ended a war would soon build bridges, railways, and factories, tools of peace in the hands of former conquerors. The moral angle victory brought not celebration, but reflection. Many American soldiers struggled with a quiet guilt they could not name. They had won a total war. But what was victory when the enemy was starving? Reports of Japanese civilians living in makeshift shelters and orphaned children combing trash heaps reached even the highest ranks of command. Among the Marines and officers, compassion began to replace resentment. "Feed them," MacArthur ordered when he learned of widespread famine. The directive spread through every camp and depot. American rations, once symbols of survival for soldiers, were now handed out to civilians. To the Japanese, it was an unimaginable act. The same hands that had destroyed their cities were now offering food to keep them alive. In that moral reversal lay a quiet redemption. The war had revealed humanity's darkest capacity, the peace, its noblest, the cultural angle. When two civilizations meet after war, understanding begins not in treaties, but in moments. For Japan and the United States, those moments happened in the streets, in gestures, glances, and unspoken exchanges. Japanese women learned English words from the soldiers who guarded food lines. Marines, in turn, learned the etiquette of bows and silence. Some soldiers kept notebooks filled with phonetic, Japanese phrases. Clumsy bridges between the streets of Tokyo, late September 1945, were no longer streets in the usual sense, just paths carved through ash and rubble. The smell of charred timber and rusted metal hung in the air. Here and there, survivors moved like shadows, pushing makeshift carts or carrying buckets of muddy water. Among them, a young Marine named Corporal James Carter, a composite figure drawn from many occupation testimonies, walked his patrol near what had once been Ueno District. His boots crunched over glass and cinders, the faint sound echoing in a silence that seemed older than the war itself. He had fought through Okinawa and seen the kind of death that never leaves a man's mind. But nothing had prepared him for this, a city defeated not by bombs, but by hunger. Turning a corner, he saw her, a woman, no older than 30, kneeling beside a collapsed wooden frame. Her kimono was torn, her face streaked with soot. She held a small metal bowl, empty, save for a few grains of rice too hard to chew. For a moment, neither moved. The Marine hesitated, his rifle slung loosely, his mind caught between duty and instinct. The woman lowered her eyes, expecting orders or dismissal, the reflex of someone who had lost everything but her pride. Carter reached into his satchel and pulled out a K-ration tin. Inside was a small portion of canned meat and biscuits. It was the same meal he had eaten on jungle battlefields. He knelt and placed it before her. She did not take it immediately. To accept was to admit need. And need, in her culture, was shame. But hunger overcame ritual. Her hands trembled as she bowed deeply, tears tracing paths through the soot on her cheeks. She whispered a single word. "Arigato." Carter nodded. "It's all right," he said quietly, though she could not understand. He gestured gently for her to stand. "Come with me." She rose, cautious but willing, and followed him toward the Marine checkpoint a few blocks away. Behind them, the ruins of Tokyo seemed to breathe again, faintly, like embers refusing to die. That brief exchange, recorded in variations by numerous occupation diaries, captured more than kindness. It marked the first fragile thread of reconciliation, where an American soldier and a Japanese civilian, once enemies, met not as conqueror and conquered, but as human beings trying to survive the same war's aftermath. What began as a single act soon echoed across the ruins of Japan. In every ward of Tokyo, scenes like that between the Marine and the woman unfolded quietly, without headlines or ceremony. Soldiers shared rations with children who had forgotten the taste of sugar. Nurses from U.S. medical units treated villagers for burns and disease in makeshift clinics set up among the debris. The sound of hammers slowly replaced the silence of fear. In early October 1945, the U.S. occupation authorities launched one of the most ambitious humanitarian efforts in modern history. From Yokohama's docks, ships unloaded thousands of tons of wheat, powdered milk, and medical supplies. American trucks rolled through scorched avenues distributing food, often guarded by the same Marines who only months earlier had been fighting to destroy Japan's war machine. Tokyo's schools, though still standing, children returned to classrooms with shattered windows and no electricity. They learned not about war, but about peace. American officers, guided by MacArthur's headquarters, encouraged new textbooks that spoke of democracy, rights, and dignity rather than conquest. For many Japanese, it was the first time they heard the word freedom without fear. The city itself began to rise again. Small shops reopened, markets formed under bridges, women exchanged handmade goods for ration tickets. U.S. soldiers and Japanese civilians, once separated by orders and mistrust, began to greet each other with nods, sometimes even smiles. Tokyo was no longer a battlefield, it was becoming a promise. Yet beneath this slow revival lay deep emotional contradictions. Many Japanese felt gratitude mixed with humiliation. The Marines, too, carried the unease of victory, haunted by memories of their fallen and the realization that the people before them had suffered as deeply as any on earth. Still, something irreversible had begun. Humanity had found a way to surface through the ashes. The woman Carter helped, her name never recorded, came daily to the checkpoint. She brought small gifts of folded paper cranes, tokens of thanks. The Marines, in turn, saved portions of their rations for her and for the children she soon gathered near the post. That small corner of Ueno became a fragile sanctuary, a living symbol of what peace could look like when compassion replaced command. From one act of kindness grew a quiet movement, the idea that mercy could rebuild what bombs had destroyed, and as Tokyo's skyline slowly filled once more with light instead of fire. It was not the sound of engines or speeches that marked the true turning point. It was the simple sound of people speaking again. The years that followed Japan's surrender were unlike any in its long history. Under the watchful yet measured authority of General Douglas MacArthur, Tokyo became the nerve center of a new experiment, the reconstruction of a defeated empire into a modern democracy. The U.S. occupation, which began in late 1945, was not only a military administration but a social revolution. Its aim was as ambitious as it was uncertain: to rebuild Japan from the ashes without extinguishing its spirit. MacArthur's headquarters, known as ESCAP, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, launched sweeping reforms that touched every corner of Japanese life. Land once held by vast estates was redistributed to farmers who had tilled it for generations without owning a single acre. The old zaibatsu, Japan's powerful industrial conglomerates, were broken apart to end the economic dominance of a few families. Factories once dedicated to producing war machines now turned to making sewing machines, bicycles, and radios, tools for a new kind of future. Among the most profound changes came in education and women's rights. In 1946, Japanese women voted for the first time in the nation's history. The voices of women, once confined to the home, began to echo through classrooms, offices, and the newly formed Diet, Japan's restructured parliament. Schools taught equality, not obedience. The idea that every citizen had inherent dignity was no longer whispered. It was written into law. Then, in 1947, a document emerged that would redefine Japan's destiny: the new Japanese Constitution. Drafted under Allied supervision yet accepted by Japanese legislators, it became the foundation of a transformed nation. It renounced war forever in Article 9, declaring that Japan would never again maintain forces for aggression. It guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, concepts that had once been unthinkable under imperial rule. To the outside world, these reforms seemed almost miraculous. Within a few short years, Japan had shifted from totalitarian militarism to participatory democracy. But inside the country, the transition was far from simple. For many, adapting to freedom was more difficult than surviving defeat. Old hierarchies resisted change. Hunger and homelessness lingered. Yet, piece by piece, the structure of a new society rose where rubble once stood. Tokyo became a laboratory of hope, a living testament that even from ruin, renewal was possible. And through every step of that transformation, American soldiers and Japanese civilians walked the same broken streets, learning together what peace truly meant. In the years that followed the occupation, a quiet transformation began, not merely in Japan's infrastructure, but in its soul. What had started as a relationship of conqueror and conquered evolved into something far more profound: an alliance born from respect, necessity, and shared humanity. The seeds of that transformation were sown in the smallest gestures: a Marine sharing his rations with a starving woman, a nurse treating an enemy child, a Japanese family offering tea to an American officer. These were not acts of diplomacy. They were acts of recognition. In them, both sides saw something that war had obscured: the simple truth that suffering and compassion knew no uniform. By the early 1950s, those gestures had become the moral foundation for a new partnership. When the Treaty of San Francisco was signed in 1951, formally ending the Allied occupation, Japan re-emerged as a sovereign nation. But unlike the bitter peace treaties of the past, this one carried no humiliation. Instead, it was a pledge that the former enemies would now stand together in the pursuit of stability and progress. America, once the destroyer of Japanese cities, became Japan's most trusted ally. Economic aid and open trade replaced artillery and air raids. Factories rebuilt under occupation guidance began to produce goods that would soon astonish the world, from radios and cameras to automobiles and electronics. Within a generation, Japan would rise from the ruins of Tokyo to become one of the most advanced economies on Earth. And through it all, the emotional distance between the two peoples continued to shrink. American teachers, engineers, and artists lived among Japanese families. Children learned English in schools rebuilt by American funds. Marriages between former foes became symbols of reconciliation that no treaty could have drafted. Historians often trace this transformation through treaties, policies, and leaders. But its real origin lies elsewhere, in the unrecorded acts of decency that took place amid destruction. The moment when one Marine extended his hand to a woman in the rubble of Tokyo was more than kindness. It was prophecy. It foretold, in the long shadow of 1945, the gesture of a single Marine extending his hand to a starving woman came to symbolize something greater than mercy. It marked the quiet moment when an empire built on conquest began its transformation into a nation built on peace. Japan's post-war story was not written only in treaties or reforms, but in countless human acts that bridged the divide between victor and vanquished.